So what exactly happened this year at the 2024 Singapore Grand Prix? Let's talk about it. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the 2024 Singapore Grand Prix won by Lando Norris and the first Singapore Grand Prix that broke a record that was long standing up until now. I'm Dakota, and here we're going to talk about our weekend quick hits, our weekend winners and losers, and then we'll wrap things up taking a look at the predictions that we made before the Grand Prix weekend began and end off with an update on our little community points championship when it comes to predictions. But first, let's go ahead and jump on into our quick hits. Before we get started with our quick hits, I want to remind you, if you haven't already, subscribe down below. We'd love to have you join our little community here. We love talking about F1. We love talking about sim racing and all forms of motorsport, really. And so we would love to have you join our little growing community. As always, leave a comment down below what you would give the Singapore Grand Prix out of 10. Give it a rating. I think if I was going to give it a rating, I'd give this one probably about a 6.5. I think it wasn't the most exciting race in the world. It definitely had a few interesting moments that ultimately didn't really pan out to much. So definitely not the worst Grand Prix I've ever seen, but definitely pretty far away from the best. But what do you guys think? Let me know down below. And as always, turn on notifications so you don't miss a single upload every time I upload a new video to the channel. But let's go ahead. Let's get this thing started with our quick hits. We're going to start off at the front. Lando Norris wins the Grand Prix, starting from pole, almost with the Grand Chelem. But unfortunately, thanks to Daniel Ricciardo taking the fastest lap on the final lap of the race, he unfortunately did not get his full gambit of achievements for this one. He obviously started on pole, led every lap, and finished first, but did not get the fastest lap. Still, a very dominant weekend from Lando Norris and McLaren. He basically showed up and was on the pace from the beginning, and honestly, it was one of the more dominant weekends that we've seen from him since probably Zandvoort. But even then, at Zandvoort, he lost the lead for a fair bit of it before ultimately coming and winning by about 20 seconds like he did here. So we saw a few moments from Lando that maybe showed he wasn't quite as focused along the way. A couple of brushes with the wall, some minor front wing damage, but ultimately it did not end up mattering as he came home to win 20 something odd seconds in the front. So definitely a dominant position from Lando. I guess it was bound to happen eventually. Moving on, we see Max Verstappen on the podium again for the first time since Zandvoort. It's not been a great run of form for Max. He hasn't won a race, I believe, since, what was it, Spain? Something like that. Let me know down in the comment section below if I'm wrong, but it's definitely been a tough going weekend for Red Bull. Ultimately, Max ended up here qualifying in second, and thanks to the track position and honestly kind of thanks to the pace that the McLaren had, Max basically had free air. Basically from the jump, Lando was able to pull a gap, which gave Max effective free air to run in P2 and effectively just manage the race from there and to finish second on the podium. Definitely probably going to take that one, especially with the struggles that Red Bull has had at Singapore the last few years. So I guess at the end of the day, they'll take a P2, whether they're happy about it or not. I think at the end of the day, they'll be pretty pleased with how they performed around Singapore. Continuing to take a look down, Mercedes had a pretty up and down weekend. There were moments where they looked pretty quick, but ultimately I think they really struggled to figure out the car setup with the tires. You saw a lot where they would flip between being very, very quick and all of a sudden struggling on tires in the same stint. And ultimately they came home for a pretty respectable finish in this one. Was it a P4 and a P6? So definitely not the greatest weekend they've ever had, but it's kind of exactly where they've been. And so I don't think it's too surprising to say the least. It's just one of those weird weekends for Mercedes. Another team that had a very odd weekend thanks to a tough qualifying session is Ferrari. Obviously in Q3, Carlos crashing out before he's sending his lap. Ultimately, he ended up starting P10, and Charles Leclerc, when he tried to set his one lap, had a track limits issue and ultimately was, had his lap time deleted. And so he ended up starting P9 in this one. They had a very good recovery race. It was a little touch and go there for Sainz. And when he took an earlier pit stop and was down, I think in like P17 at one point, ultimately coming home and finishing well inside the top 10. Definitely nothing to be ashamed of there. For Carlos, and Charles ended up coming home in P5. So a very good recovery race. It would have been interesting to see what the fight at the front would have been like if they had actually managed to be able to set their laps. But at the end of the day, they can only race the race from where they started, and a very good result, all things considered. Speaking of great races, all things considered, have to give a special shout out to Nico Hülkenberg, my Haas boy. As a Haas fan, was a lovely, lovely Saturday. Seeing him finish P6 in qualifying, equaling, I believe, his best qualifying to I think, ever in Haas, and so I think it equaled it in Singapore, a track not many people, and me included, really expected Haas to be particularly good at. Ultimately, he came home in the race and finished P9, which I think is pretty respectable considering the cars that ended up passing him probably should have been in front of him anyway. Those being Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz. Fernando Alonso did end up undercutting him and finishing ahead, but ultimately a very positive result for Nico, bringing home a couple of points as Haas continues to try and push for P6 in the Constructors' title. I, for one, think it looks like a pretty good, solid opportunity. I was a little nervous there for a little bit when Yuki also made it into Q3 and ultimately ended up qualifying, I believe, P8 on the road, so it definitely has a bit of a sweating match a little bit at the beginning, but I knew Nico would be able to bring it home some points and bring him two, and ultimately Yuki unable to stay in the top 10. I believe at the beginning he kind of got caught out in the first couple of turns, ultimately finishing outside the points. So I believe Haas now is only, 3 or 4 or 5 odd points away from VCarb in the Constructors' title, so it's definitely there for the taking. They've scored points in 3 consecutive race weekends, which has been a very long time since I think I've ever seen that, or I don't know if I've ever seen that, but at the same time, very good weekend for Haas. I will take it every single day of the week. Speaking of very good performances, but this time maybe not quite as fortuitous when it comes to getting actual results for it, is Franco Colapinto. Obviously, with Alex Albon's overheating issue, he was the lone Williams to finish this race, but he qualified basically right on the gearbox of his teammates. I believe they started in P11 and 12 in this one, and he had an absolute send of a lifetime at the beginning of this race and got it stopped and around the corner cleanly to ultimately put him up into the points for a good fair amount of time, but ultimately kind of fell back to P11, and I think you could tell after the race was over that he was really struggling with the conditions of Singapore. Obviously, it's very hot, it's very humid, and with Singapore not having a safety car this year, I think it was a case of he was just trying to bring it home as safely as possible, because you could tell in his post-race radio that he was absolutely destroyed, along with a lot of drivers, but it was a very good, well-run race by Franco, and if he had felt potentially a little bit better down the course of this race, I mean, he was on the back of Sergio Perez, who was in P10 for a good last 10 to 15 laps, and ultimately was a couple of moments away from potentially challenging, but the way we saw how he was feeling probably wasn't too up to attacking that much at that set time. But if he, was he feeling a little better? Who knows what would have happened. And then I think we'll end our quick hit session by talking about Daniel Ricciardo. Ultimately ended up finishing this one, I believe, in P17 or P18 with the fastest lap, taking the fastest lap. And I believe I saw a rumor, I haven't confirmed this, that he actually set the new Singapore lap record with his final lap, and could be potentially his final lap in the VCAR. There's been a lot of speculation this weekend that this could be his last race in VCAR, with Liam Lawson potentially taking over after this next month-long break when F1 returns at Circuit of the Americas. If that's true, I think it's a very hard way to see Daniel go out. I think a lot of people would expect that a driver like Daniel to be able to be given the rest of the year. But at this, all said and done, this is Formula One, and especially in the Red Bull family, where we've seen how ruthless they've been in the past. If this ends up being Daniel Ricciardo's last race, I think winning driver of the day, I think getting the fastest lap, and if it's true, the new Singapore lap record, I think would actually be a pretty good send-off, all things considered. We saw in his post-race comments how broken up he was about it. There's a lot of talk about, they don't know, they have to review, but the way that it was looking, I mean, from Daniel's reaction to the team's reaction, I think it's pretty much set in stone at this point, and we're just waiting on a official team release. So it's unfortunate to see a driver like Daniel, try and get back into the Red Bull family after a very tough stretch at McLaren. It's not the way you want to see a driver like him go out, and my heart goes out to him and his fans in particular. That's a very tough way to see it, but at the same time, that's what you get in Formula One sometimes. So Danny, thank you. If this does end up being your last go around in F1, it was an absolute pleasure to get to watch you these last couple of years. I know it wasn't always the easiest, but you could just tell how much you enjoy being there and being a part of everything. So thank you. All right, let's move on before we get a little too teary-eyed in this video, and we'll move on to our weekend winners and losers. And we're going to start with our weekend winners, and my honorable mention weekend winner is Nico Hülkenberg this week, just because qualifying P6 in a Haas, converting it into 2 points when they're in a tough fight with VCAR for P6 in the Constructors' title is a huge result for the team. And while you could say that he should have finished higher, I think if you look at every single car that finished ahead of him or had passed him over the course of the race, was a car car that probably should have been ahead of him anyway. And so to qualify P6 and convert it into a multiple points finish rather than just a single point that it seems to have been the last couple of races is definitely huge. They're now only a couple of points behind VCARB for P6 in the constructors, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do in a month's time. But without further ado, my weekend winner overall is Franco Colapinto in this one. I think this is a race that is unlike any he's probably done before. The physicality, the conditions, the no safety car in Singapore portion is definitely a recipe for disaster when it comes to a rookie who's in his third race in F1 ever. And not only did he show very good pace, he showed a lot of daring at the start of the race. He showed a lot of speed for qualifying only 0.007 behind his teammate in P12. And then ultimately coming just a couple of seconds off of finishing in the points around Singapore and Williams has to be worth mentioning. I think this is one of those races that is kind of tough to find exactly the biggest winner and loser, but of all of the performances, outside of my own bias when it comes to Nico and Haas, I think Franco Colapinto performed admirably all weekend long and is definitely worthy of a weekend winner. And now let's move on to my pick for weekend loser. In this one, I've actually gone for kind of Singapore as a whole. This is a race that a lot of people kind of look at similar-ish to Monaco, with potentially less of the prestige of Monaco, and added, sort of interest in it being, the original night race, a very interesting race, and just a lot of the qualities that kind of go along with Singapore. And ultimately this one, we have broken a streak of a safety car appearing in 100% of the races that have ever been held in Singapore, to no yellow flags even in the race. We had 2 retirements, but they were able to make it back to the pits. So there was no VSCs, there was no safety cars, there was no yellow flags, and it was a pretty cleanly run race from start to finish. And I think that kind of made a lot of people realize that maybe Singapore, while I think the changes to the track that they've made, cutting out the stadium section, have been better. They added a 4th DRS zone, but ultimately we saw that it was very, very, very hard to pass unless you were very clearly on a much bigger tire offset than the driver who was in front. And so this was a not as quite as interesting race to watch. I think there was a lot of intriguing moments that, had a safety car triggered, might have been, a very interesting moment. It really spiced it up in those moments. Ultimately, with no safety cars coming out, I think it was a very processional. It was all about track position, similar to Monaco, and just ultimately kind of not necessarily fell flat. There were intriguing moments, but at the same time, when the race ended, it's not like there were too many surprises when you look back on it. It also set the record for the fastest Singapore Grand Prix ever, obviously without a safety car that's going to go faster. And so I think it was one of the races of all time with some intriguing moments. So I think I'm just going to go with Singapore overall in general, mainly also because it really was hard to pick an individual winner or loser or a team loser from this weekend. And so I think overall we're just going to kind of go with the interesting bits of Singapore just did not seem to appear, and so I'm going to give it to them in general. The Singapore Grand Prix, you're my weekend loser this year. Okay, let's quickly move along to look at my predictions results and then take a look at our predictions standings. There's been a bit of a shakeup this weekend. Not the most highest scoring weekend we've ever had amongst the community, but we'll go ahead and run through the predictions that I made. We'll start with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went for Carlos Sainz this weekend. Carlos obviously coming off of the win in 2023 here in Singapore. I thought he was going to be able to come back and perform very well again. Ultimately, a crash in qualifying ultimately ended basically that dream from the start. And it was just a recovery race from there. He still ended up recovering very, very well, but definitely not enough for me to give biggest positive surprise to, especially with his crash in qualifying. Or if maybe I can make an argument with myself that if he had just had his lap time deleted like Charles, maybe we could have done something there. But considering it was a crash and he didn't even set a time in Q3, and then ultimately kind of just finished, in the middle of the points finishers, I can't give myself a point for that. So none there. As we move on to my pick for biggest disappointment, I think I went with the right team, wrong driver in this one. I went for Fernando Alonso. I don't think Aston Martin was particularly great around here. And so I went with Fernando because I think it would be a lot more obvious if he had a tough day. But ultimately, I think he ended basically exactly where you would expect an Aston Martin to finish. And ultimately, it was a pretty decent result for them. What I should have done is gone for Lance Stroll, who finished basically at the bottom, or at least it felt like it, and it would have probably gone a lot further for me, but at the same time, no points for me there either, as, he finished, P8 in this one, I think, and so definitely a solid points finish for Fernando here, especially in an Aston Martin that I thought was going to perform a little bit worse, but ultimately, I can't give myself a point for this one. Looking at my qualifying top 3, I got 1 point total out of the 3 possible here. I had a Lando Norris pole position, which obviously ended up coming true. I then had a Carlos Sainz P2 in this one, and then an Oscar Piastri P3. Obviously, Oscar did not have quite the qualifying performance that I expected him to. He'd been performing very, very well recently, but apparently Singapore and him in qualifying just don't get along yet, and so I think he ended up starting in P5, so pretty well off the pace. And then obviously with Carlos's crash, wasn't nowhere near the top 3 at that point, so just the 1 point for getting Lando on pole correct. As we move on to my race podium, I did also get another point here for a Lando Norris win. Obviously, track position, very important around Singapore. And even though I wasn't sure if he was going to be able to hold the lead on lap 1, I think that would have been fast enough to make up for it. Obviously, didn't even need to go that far. He very quickly just sauntered off into the distance, coming home in P1, so there's a point for me there. I predicted an Oscar Piastri P2, which was probably close-ish if he had qualified even, say, P4 rather than P5. I think it definitely might have been more on, but unfortunately just the gap between him and Max at the end was just a little too much. And so ultimately he ended up coming home in 3rd. So a half point for predicting him in the top 3, just in the wrong spot. And then I had a Carlos Sainz podium here, which again, who knows what would have happened had they had a normal qualifying, but unfortunately no points for me there. So 1.5 out of 3 in terms of race podium. We'll take it, it's better than nothing. And then rounding things out with my one crazy prediction, I predicted that we would see a Red Bull finish outside the points on pace alone. And so a crash or an incident that would have forced them down the order would not have counted. And we were very, very close to this. It's kind of what I was mentioning with Franco Colapinto. If he had been feeling a little bit better, we potentially could have seen this. But Checo unfortunately Checo came home to finish in P10 and getting a point. So unfortunately for me, no point for me there. So ultimately, if I take a look at my notes, if I do the math and I do it correctly, I believe I finished the weekend with 2.5 points. Definitely not one of my finer weekends in terms of our community predictions championship. But as we take a look at our point standings in general, we had a very good weekend. Pretty much, it was a pretty even weekend overall, with British, unfortunately, for me, getting the most points here with 3.5. So he actually takes the lead in our championship now with me at 64 points. British now on 65. Senel 40 is a half a point above me, so he has lost his lead in the championship. And then F1 Inferno now on 39.5. And unfortunately, Andrew did not get his predictions in on time, so he remains at 36.5. Definitely a fun one this weekend. I think a lot happened that we weren't quite ready for, and ultimately ended up being a very mid-level weekend in terms of predictions across the board. But what did you guys think? Did the race live up to your expectations? Let me know down in the comment section below. But guys, that only leaves one question remaining. Where does F1 go next? We now have another month off of F1 before they return in the US of A. The US Grand Prix in Austin, Texas. The Circuit of the Americas is up next in 4 weeks from now. I'm very excited about that race. Why? Because I'm going to be there. It's going to be a lot of fun. We've gone to the race the last, this will be our 3rd year in a row of going to the race. I'm super excited. Potentially, I would love to potentially even meet anybody who is also going to be there. If they happen to be friends of the channel, I'd love to try and maybe, get in touch, and I'd love to, set something up. It'd be a lot of fun, I think. But I'm very excited for the US Grand Prix. It's always a lot of fun. COTA is a great track, and it always seems to bring out some intrigue, as we saw last year with Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc being disqualified for plank wear. And it was a pretty good race all said and done, and then it ultimately got a little spicy after it was all said and done. So F1 has a month off before they return to the United States and finishing out the last handful of rounds of this year. It's hard to believe the year's already coming down to it like it is now. We have 6 races remaining, and it's going to fly by, I promise you. So we'll enjoy this month off, I guess. I'll be missing it definitely towards the end, but a nice month off might do us all a little good to recover from everything that's been going on. But guys, that is going to wrap up our race recap here for the Singapore Grand Prix. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you made it this far, leave a like rating on the video and check out everything else that's on the channel. I'd love for you to stick around. That's going to wrap it up for me here, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.